Her ex-husband humiliated her in court, but when she revealed her secret, the judge gasped. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sophia sat in silence, her hands resting calmly on the polished wooden table in front of her. She could hear the murmurs of the audience behind her, a mix of curious onlookers and those who had already taken sides. Her ex-husband, Daniel, was sitting confidently across the aisle, his smirk unwavering as he leaned back in his chair. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, radiating an air of arrogance, as if he had already won before the trial had even begun. To him, this was just a formality, one last opportunity to trample over the woman he had spent years belittling. The judge, a stern-looking man with graying hair, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "We are here today to finalize the divorce settlement between Mr. Daniel Carter and Mrs. Sophia Carter," he announced. "Mr. Carter, your legal counsel may begin." Daniel's lawyer, a sharp-faced man in his 50s, rose with a knowing smile and buttoned his expensive suit. "Your Honor, my client was the sole provider in this marriage," he began, his voice oozing with condescension. "Mrs. Carter, while undoubtedly enjoying the luxuries provided by my client, contributed little, if anything, to the household. It is clear that she is not entitled to any substantial financial compensation." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Sophia remained still, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated this. Daniel had always been the kind of man who needed to dominate, to be seen as superior. He had controlled every aspect of their marriage, ensuring that she was always dependent on him, or at least, that's what he thought. She could feel the eyes on her, the silent judgment of those who believed his version of the story. Daniel, ever the performer, stood and addressed the judge himself. "Your Honor, I built my company from the ground up. I worked tirelessly to provide for us while she lived in comfort. She was nothing but a burden." His voice dripped with disdain, and a chuckle escaped his lips. "She never contributed to my success. In fact, she slowed me down." The audience reacted audibly this time, some gasping at his cruelty, others nodding in agreement. Daniel turned his gaze to Sophia, his smirk widening. He expected her to break, to stammer in defense. But Sophia only inhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of a folder in front of her. She had let him speak, let him weave his web of lies. Now, it was her turn. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth, composed. "Before you make a ruling, I have something important to present." The entire room fell silent as she reached for the folder. Even Daniel's smug expression flickered with a hint of unease. Daniel shifted in his seat, the first sign of discomfort flickering across his face. He was used to seeing Sophia shrink in his presence, to watching her second-guess her every word whenever he cut her down. But today, she wasn't playing her usual role. The way she held herself, poised, confident, unmoved, sent an unsettling feeling through his chest. He scoffed, crossing his arms. "What could you possibly have to say that matters?" he sneered. Sophia ignored him, directing her attention to the judge as she handed over the documents. The judge adjusted his glasses once more and took the folder from her, flipping it open. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, his expression shifted from neutrality to intrigue, and then to complete shock. His lips parted slightly, his gaze darting back to Sophia before returning to the pages in front of him. Daniel noticed the change and leaned forward. "Your Honor, what is this nonsense?" he demanded. He turned to his lawyer, who had gone pale, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The audience, sensing something major was unfolding, whispered among themselves, their excitement growing. The judge took a deep breath before looking back up at Sophia. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Are you telling me that you own Carter Enterprises?" The room erupted in gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, while those in attendance leaned forward, desperate to catch every word. Daniel's face twisted in confusion before breaking into a forced laugh. "What kind of joke is this?" he scoffed. "Everyone knows Carter Enterprises is my company. I built it from nothing." His voice was louder now, less controlled. Sophia finally turned to face him, and for the first time, she met his eyes without a trace of fear. "Did you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Because these documents say otherwise." She gestured toward the judge, who was still holding the papers, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I was the one who founded Carter Enterprises. I developed the business model, secured the first major investors, and managed the finances. I stepped down when Daniel convinced me that our marriage required my full attention. But I never relinquished my ownership." Daniel's lawyer frantically grabbed the documents from the judge's hand, scanning them in horror. His face darkened. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, barely concealing his panic, "these documents are legitimate." Daniel's eyes widened as he yanked the pages away from his lawyer, his fingers trembling as he flipped through them. His breathing grew uneven, his bravado fading with each second. Sophia clasped her hands together, watching the realization dawn upon him. "You always claimed you did everything alone," she said softly. "But the truth is, without me, you would have had nothing." The judge cleared his throat, regaining control of the courtroom. "Given this new evidence, the court will reassess all claims regarding asset division," he declared. The power shift was undeniable. The man who had walked in believing he would leave victorious was now drowning in disbelief. Daniel's fingers trembled as he flipped through the documents again, desperately searching for some mistake, some loophole that would prove this was all a misunderstanding. But no such error existed. The courtroom remained silent, save for the occasional murmur of disbelief. His lawyer sat stiffly beside him, staring down at the pages as if they might suddenly change before his eyes. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath, his face darkening. "This is my company." His voice rose as he slammed a hand against the table, causing an audible gasp from the audience. Sophia remained calm, watching him unravel. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "the paperwork clearly outlines my role in the company's foundation. The investment records show my contributions. The business contracts bear my signature. If Mr. Carter would like to dispute these facts, I encourage him to provide his own documentation proving otherwise." The judge turned his stern gaze to Daniel, who sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing without a single word forming. The weight of the truth had finally begun to crush him. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to strip Sophia of everything, but instead, it was his own empire that was slipping away. The judge sighed, adjusting his glasses before addressing Daniel directly. "Mr. Carter, you've presented this case under the assumption that Carter Enterprises was solely your accomplishment. However, these documents tell a very different story. They indicate that Mrs. Carter was not only an integral part of the company's success but its actual founder." His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the judgment behind it. "Do you have any evidence to counter these claims?" Daniel's mind raced. He had spent years telling people the same story, that he had single-handedly built his success, that Sophia had merely been along for the ride. He had repeated the lie so many times that even he had started to believe it. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Daniel barely heard him. His thoughts were clouded by panic. How could he have let this happen? How could he have underestimated her? He had always assumed Sophia would remain the quiet, submissive woman he had molded her into, that she would never dare challenge him. Yet here she was, standing taller than ever, holding proof that he was nothing without her. He swallowed hard, straightening his tie. He hesitated, the weight of the lie pressing down on him. I need time to review these documents. The judge arched an eyebrow. You had plenty of time before this trial, Mr. Carter. This court will not wait while you scramble for an excuse. The realization hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He was losing control. The judge's words left no room for argument, no escape route for him to slither through. His lawyer, previously confident, now looked as though he wanted to be anywhere but in that courtroom. Across the room, Sophia remained still, her expression unreadable. But Daniel could feel her power growing, filling the space he once dominated. She had waited for this moment, had prepared for it meticulously. He clenched his fists beneath the table, trying to maintain whatever composure he had left. He refused to let her see him break. Sophia finally turned to him, her voice deceptively soft. You always dismissed my efforts, she said, tilting her head slightly. You told me I was lucky to have you, that without you, I would be nothing. But the truth is, Daniel, it was the other way around. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to throw more insults at her, but the truth left no room for deception. The audience whispered among themselves, absorbing the dramatic reversal. The judge cleared his throat, redirecting the attention back to the bench. Given the new evidence, we will proceed with a reassessment of financial assets and ownership rights. Daniel swallowed hard. He had walked into this trial expecting to humiliate Sophia, but now, he was the one drowning in disgrace. Daniel leaned back in his chair, attempting to steady his breath as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He could feel the courtroom's collective gaze, the silent judgment hanging in the air. For years, he had reveled in admiration, painting himself as the self-made man, the genius behind Carter Enterprises. Now, in a matter of minutes, that carefully constructed illusion had been shattered. He glanced at Sophia, hoping to find some sign of weakness, some hesitation that would give him an opening. But she remained poised, her hands neatly folded on the table, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to give him an inch. His lawyer cleared his throat and leaned in. We can attempt to challenge the authenticity of these documents, he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Maybe argue that she signed under duress. Daniel shook his head sharply. Even he knew that was a losing battle. The documents were airtight, every detail meticulously outlined. Sophia had planned for this. She had been waiting for the moment he underestimated her, and now, there was no way out. He swallowed, forcing himself to sit up straighter. Your Honor, he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence, I need more time to prepare a defense. The judge gave him a long, measured look. No, Mr. Carter. The time for deception has passed. We will proceed. The shift in the courtroom was undeniable. Just moments ago, Daniel had commanded the room, speaking with arrogance, expecting unwavering support. Now, murmurs filled the air, and glances that had once held admiration now reflected something else: pity, disappointment, scorn. Even those who had believed in his story, who had whispered their approval as he belittled Sophia, were beginning to question everything. His greatest fear wasn't just losing the case, it was losing his reputation. He had built his identity around success, around power. If he wasn't the brilliant entrepreneur he claimed to be, then what was he? Sophia exhaled quietly, as if releasing years of silent endurance in a single breath. "You always wanted me to be invisible," she said, her voice measured. "You needed me to stay in the shadows so you could shine. But the truth has a way of finding the light, Daniel." He clenched his jaw, refusing to look at her. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, restoring order. "In light of this evidence, the financial review will begin immediately." Daniel's stomach churned. He had thought he was coming here to watch Sophia lose everything. Instead, he was watching his empire slip through his fingers, piece by piece. The tension in the room thickened as the financial review commenced. One by one, the documents were analyzed, confirming that Sophia held rightful ownership of the company Daniel had falsely claimed as his own. The more the evidence stacked against him, the more he felt the walls closing in. His breathing grew shallow. Every asset he had once flaunted, his house, his cars, his lavish lifestyle, had been built on a foundation he never truly owned. And now, Sophia was pulling the rug out from under him with a single, devastating truth. Sophia leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You thought you could erase me," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. "But I was never gone, Daniel. You just never saw me." His stomach twisted into knots. The judge took a deep breath before speaking. "Given the overwhelming evidence, this court will determine the proper division of assets in the coming days." The gavel struck down. Daniel flinched. He had come here expecting to leave with everything. Instead, he was walking out of that courtroom with nothing. Daniel's fingers curled into fists beneath the table as he struggled to keep his breathing even. The air in the courtroom felt thick, suffocating. He had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, ensuring that power remained firmly in his grasp. Now, it was slipping away, not in slow, agonizing increments, but in an instant, like sand slipping through his fingers. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that Sophia would never dare challenge him. And yet, here she was, tearing down the empire he had built on lies, brick by brick. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look at the judge, whose gaze was expectant. His lawyer had gone quiet beside him, no longer whispering strategies, no longer trying to salvage what little ground they had left. It was clear to everyone now, Daniel wasn't the business genius he had always claimed to be. He was a fraud, and worse, he was a fraud who had built his reputation by diminishing the woman who had truly made everything possible. He clenched his jaw, trying to come up with something, anything, to turn the tide back in his favor. But there was nothing left. The documents were indisputable, the truth undeniable. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, waiting for him to react, to fight back. But for the first time in his life, he had no move to make. The murmurs in the courtroom had shifted. Earlier, they had been filled with judgment against Sophia, believing her to be nothing more than an opportunist, a woman looking to take advantage of her husband's wealth. Now, those same voices whispered in awe, in disbelief. How had no one seen it before? How had Daniel managed to fool so many? Reporters scratched furiously at their notepads, their headlines already forming in their minds. The man who had humiliated his wife in public was now being publicly humiliated himself. The poetic justice of it all wasn't lost on anyone. Sophia remained composed, though inside, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She had dreamed of this day, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. She had needed to reclaim what was rightfully hers, to prove to herself that she had never been weak, never been lesser. "Your Honor," her lawyer finally spoke, cutting through the noise. Given the overwhelming evidence, we request an immediate reassessment of asset division. My client has suffered immense financial and personal loss due to Mr. Carter's fraudulent claims, and we believe she is entitled to full control over Carter Enterprises. The judge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. We will deliberate on this matter, he said, but given what we have seen today, a reassessment is more than warranted. Daniel felt like the room was spinning. Everything that had once been certain, his wealth, his reputation, his power, was crumbling. He had never believed this would happen. In his mind, Sophia had always been the weaker one, the woman who had needed him to survive. He had built their life with the assumption that she would always be beneath him, that she would never dare rise above. And yet, in one afternoon, she had dismantled him entirely. His name, once synonymous with success, was now tainted with disgrace. How long would it take before the board of directors at Carter Enterprises removed him? Before investors began pulling their money? Before he was no longer welcome in the very world he had fought to dominate? Sophia turned to him, her expression unreadable. For years, she had watched him walk through life with a confidence that came from a foundation of lies. She had stayed silent, believing that one day, he might acknowledge her contributions, might give her the credit she deserved. But that day had never come. Instead, he had laughed at her, humiliated her, convinced her that she was insignificant. But now, she had her answer. You always told me I was nothing without you, she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. But now, we both know the truth. You were always nothing without me. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. The press had already gathered, waiting for the moment the trial ended so they could swarm the fallen businessman and the woman who had proven to be the true force behind his success. Inside, Daniel sat frozen, his mind blank. He had always known how to talk his way out of trouble, how to spin a story in his favor, but today, words failed him. No carefully crafted narrative could undo the damage that had just been done. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, and now, he was paying the price. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to make his ruling. Given the evidence presented today, it is the decision of this court that a full reassessment of Carter Enterprises' ownership will take place. Until such time, all assets are to be frozen, and no financial transactions or decisions shall be made by Mr. Carter without prior court approval. A wave of whispers erupted through the room. Freezing his assets? This was worse than Daniel had expected. If he couldn't access his wealth, he couldn't control the situation. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized, for the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. As the courtroom doors swung open, flashes from cameras erupted like a lightning storm. Reporters pushed forward, microphones extended, desperate to be the first to get a comment. Mrs. Carter, did you know all along that you still had ownership of the company? Mr. Carter, how do you respond to today's ruling? Is this the end of Carter Enterprises as we know it? The questions flew at them from every direction, but Sophia remained composed, stepping carefully down the courthouse steps. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. The difference between her and Daniel was that she had nothing to hide. Daniel, however, was suffocating. The cameras, the reporters, the eyes on him, it was too much. He had come to this courthouse expecting to leave victorious, to celebrate his final triumph over Sophia. Instead, he was walking out as a man whose legacy had been dismantled. His lawyer tried to usher him past the reporters, but it was too late. Mr. Carter, one journalist called, her voice loud enough to cut through the crowd. How does it feel to lose everything in a single day? Daniel's face twisted with fury, but he said nothing. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Sophia exhaled slowly as she stepped into her waiting car, shutting out the chaos behind her. She had won, but the battle wasn't over. There were still legal proceedings to finalize, still decisions to be made about the company she had founded. But she had reclaimed her name, her legacy. She had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she was more than Daniel's discarded wife. She had been the foundation of Carter Enterprises, and now she would decide its future. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, she allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. It had been a long fight, one filled with pain, humiliation, and betrayal. But she had come out stronger. Daniel had tried to erase her, had tried to convince the world that she was nothing. But today, she had reminded them all exactly who she was. And now, with the world watching, she was ready to take back everything that had always been hers. Daniel sat in the back seat of his car, staring blankly out the window as the city lights blurred past him. The silence inside the vehicle was suffocating. His lawyer had tried to offer some words of encouragement, some desperate attempt to spin the disaster into something salvageable, but Daniel had waved him off. There was nothing left to salvage. His reputation had been publicly dismantled, his company slipping from his grasp, and the very woman he had spent years belittling had become the face of his downfall. He had walked into that courtroom believing he was untouchable, yet now, the world saw him for what he truly was, a fraud. The thought sent a bitter taste through his mouth. He had spent years building a persona, a carefully curated image of success and dominance. He had crafted a reality where he was always in control, always the one with the upper hand. And Sophia? She had been nothing more than an accessory in that world, a figure in the background of his story. But today, she had rewritten the narrative. She had stripped him of the illusion he had so carefully maintained, and the worst part was that he had never seen it coming. He had underestimated her, assumed she would always be weak, always be the woman he had shaped her to be. But she had been playing a longer game, and he had lost spectacularly. Inside Carter Enterprises, chaos erupted. The board members sat in stunned silence as the news reports rolled across their screens, each one more damning than the last. They had heard the rumors before the trial, whispers that Sophia had some stake in the company, but they had dismissed them as irrelevant. Now, with the courtroom ruling placing all financial transactions under court supervision, they realized how badly they had miscalculated. Without unrestricted access to company funds, their hands were tied. Investors were calling, demanding explanations. The stock had already begun to plummet. If Sophia truly regained full control, their futures were uncertain. One of the senior board members, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, finally spoke. "We need damage control," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to distance ourselves from Daniel Carter immediately. The public perception is shifting, and if we don't align ourselves with the right side, we'll all go down with him." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Loyalty had always belonged to Daniel, but loyalty meant nothing when survival was at stake. They had backed the wrong horse, and now, they needed to act fast before Sophia stripped them of their positions just as easily as she had stripped Daniel of his credibility. Sophia sat in her lawyer's office, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The weight of what she had accomplished was beginning to settle in. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The court had frozen Daniel's assets, but there was still the matter of reclaiming full ownership of Carter Enterprises. The board would resist. They had been complicit in Daniel's deception, propping up his false image while quietly reaping the benefits of her work. They would not surrender power easily. But she was ready for them. Her lawyer set down a stack of papers in front of her. "With the court ruling in our favor, we have leverage," he said. The board is panicking. They know they backed the wrong person, and some of them will be looking for a way to secure their own interests. We can use that to our advantage. Sophia nodded slowly, considering the implications. She had spent years in the shadows, allowing others to make decisions that should have been hers. Not anymore. She had clawed her way back into the light, and she wasn't about to let anyone push her back into the darkness. Carter Enterprises was her legacy, and she was ready to take it back on her terms. Daniel stormed into his penthouse, slamming the door behind him. His mind raced, every scenario playing out in his head, each one worse than the last. He had always believed that power was his birthright, that no one, not even Sophia, could take it from him. But now, as he stood in the center of the apartment he might soon lose, the reality of his situation pressed down on him like a vice. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from board members, from lawyers, from reporters hungry for a statement. He ignored them all. He needed a plan, a way to turn the tide before it was too late. He poured himself a drink, his hands unsteady. He had spent years crafting the perfect life, the perfect image. And now? It was crumbling. He couldn't let Sophia win. He refused to be erased, to be reduced to nothing. He would find a way to fight back. He always did. His mind whirled through possibilities, appealing the court's decision, leaking false information to the press, anything to discredit Sophia. But deep down, a sickening truth gnawed at him. She had beaten him. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to make things right. Sophia watched the news coverage unfold with a detached calmness. The headlines were ruthless. Carter Enterprises scandal, the truth behind the power struggle, the woman behind the empire, how Sophia Carter exposed her ex-husband's lies. Every article, every broadcast painted a picture of Daniel as a fraud and Sophia as the brilliant mind he had tried to erase. And the public? They were eating it up. Social media was flooded with comments, most of them in her favor. Women praised her for taking back what was hers. Business analysts dissected the case, marveling at how Daniel had been exposed. She should have felt vindicated. But all she felt was exhaustion. This battle had consumed years of her life, and though she had won, it wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones. Daniel wouldn't go down quietly. He was too prideful, too desperate. He would try to regain control by any means necessary. And when he did, she needed to be ready. The difference between them, she realized, was that she wasn't afraid of starting over. She had already lost everything once. If she had to fight again, she would. Because this time, she wasn't fighting to prove her worth, she was fighting to make sure no one could take it away again. The board of Carter Enterprises met in a private conference room, tension thick in the air. For years, they had operated under the assumption that Daniel Carter would always be their leader. He had commanded the company with arrogance, but they had tolerated it because he brought them profit. Now, everything had changed. Investors were withdrawing. Stock prices had plummeted overnight. Their futures were at risk, and the cause of it all was the very man they had once trusted. One of the senior members cleared his throat. "We need to act before this gets worse," he said. "We can't afford to be dragged down with him." The others nodded in agreement, though some remained hesitant. They had been loyal to Daniel for years. But loyalty meant nothing when survival was on the line. Another board member leaned forward. Sophia Carter holds the key to fixing this. If we want to save the company, we have to back her. Whether Daniel likes it or not. The decision hung heavy in the air. But deep down, they all knew Daniel Carter's reign was over. The only question was whether he would realize it before it was too late. Daniel sat in his office, staring blankly at his phone as yet another call from the board went unanswered. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to step aside, to relinquish control, to let Sophia take what was his. The very thought made his skin crawl. He had spent years ensuring that he was the one in power, that he was the face of Carter Enterprises. Yet, in a matter of days, everything had unraveled. His grip on the company had loosened, and now, the people who had once stood by him were looking for a way to cut him loose. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed to act fast, to remind them that he wasn't done yet. But before he could strategize, his lawyer entered the room, his expression tense. "Daniel," he said carefully, placing a document on the desk. "You need to see this." With a sinking feeling, Daniel flipped through the pages, his breath catching as he reached the last one. It was a formal petition from the board, requesting an emergency vote to remove him as CEO. His stomach twisted. The people he had trusted, the ones who had benefited from his leadership, were turning against him. And worst of all, Sophia hadn't even lifted a finger. They were doing it themselves. Sophia sat in the conference room of her lawyer's office, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. Across from her sat one of Carter Enterprises' senior board members, a woman named Eleanor Shaw. Eleanor had been one of Daniel's strongest allies, a fierce businesswoman who had never hidden her disdain for Sophia. Yet now, she sat with her hands folded, her expression carefully neutral. "I won't waste your time," Eleanor said, her voice measured. "The board is preparing to remove Daniel. When that happens, we need to ensure the company remains stable. That means we need you to take over." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic of her cup. She had expected this moment, but not so soon. "And why should I trust you?" she asked. "You spent years enabling Daniel, watching him erase me from the company I built. Why should I believe that you suddenly want me in charge?" Eleanor exhaled, her gaze steady. "Because we all made a mistake," she admitted. "We backed the wrong person, and now we're paying for it. You're the only one who can fix this. Whether you trust us or not, the fact remains, we need you." Sophia studied her carefully, weighing her words. She had no illusions about the board's motivations. They weren't switching sides out of loyalty or regret. They were doing it to save themselves. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time, they were acknowledging the truth: she was the one who should have been in charge all along. The boardroom was filled with an air of quiet tension. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, but the anger in his eyes betrayed him. The senior members of Carter Enterprises sat in their usual seats, but today, something felt different. They weren't looking at him with the same deference. Instead, they shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, their silence speaking volumes. Daniel already knew what was coming, but hearing it would be another matter entirely. One of the board members, a man who had once been Daniel's most loyal supporter, cleared his throat. "Daniel," he began carefully, "we've reviewed the current state of the company, and given the legal restrictions on your assets, "We believe it's in Carter Enterprises' best interest to move forward under new leadership." The words struck like a physical blow. Daniel sat back, forcing a chuckle. "New leadership?" he repeated, feigning amusement. "And who exactly do you have in mind?" The answer came swiftly. Sophia Carter. The name sent a jolt of fury through him, but he didn't let it show. "So that's it," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You're all just going to throw me out?" Eleanor Shaw met his gaze without flinching. "We're doing what's best for the company," she said. "This isn't personal." But they all knew that was a lie. It was personal. Daniel had built his empire on arrogance, and now, that very arrogance was leading to his downfall. Sophia arrived at Carter Enterprises headquarters just as the emergency board meeting came to a close. She didn't rush inside, didn't storm through the doors demanding control. Instead, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had fought for this moment, but now that it was here, the reality of it settled in. This was the company she had built, the one she had poured her heart into. And after all these years, it was finally being returned to her. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floors, her posture poised. The board members were already filing out of the conference room, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. When Eleanor saw her, she gave a slight nod. "It's done," she said simply. "Daniel has been removed." Sophia let out a slow breath, absorbing the weight of those words. It was official. He was gone. But there was no time to dwell on his downfall. Now, she had to focus on rebuilding. "Then let's get to work," she said, stepping into the boardroom, reclaiming the seat that had always been hers. Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. His phone was silent now. The board had made their choice, and just like that, he was out. No more calls, no more power, no more empire. He had spent years cultivating his image, making sure the world saw him as an untouchable force. But in the end, he had been undone by the very thing he had underestimated, Sophia. He had dismissed her, treated her like a footnote in his success story, but she had been the one writing the narrative all along. His fingers tightened around his glass as he took a slow sip of whiskey. He had always believed that he was invincible, that he would always find a way to come out on top. But now, he had nothing. The name Carter still hung on the company's building, but it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the woman he had tried to erase. And that truth burned more than any loss he had ever experienced. Carter Enterprises had been in turmoil, but Sophia wasted no time in setting things right. The moment she stepped into her new role as CEO, she began unraveling the mess Daniel had left behind. She called meetings with key investors, reassured partners, and implemented policies that put the company back on track. Employees who had spent years walking on eggshells around Daniel now looked at her with something different, respect. She moved through the halls with quiet confidence, stopping to greet workers she hadn't seen in years, thanking them for their dedication. She had spent too long watching from the sidelines, allowing others to dictate her worth. Not anymore. This was her company, her future, and she was ready to lead it on her own terms. The media had been relentless in covering the fallout of Daniel's downfall, but now, the narrative was shifting. Articles praised Sophia's leadership, highlighting how she had rebuilt Carter Enterprises from the brink of collapse. Investors who had once doubted her were now singing her praises. For the first time, she wasn't just Daniel Carter's ex-wife. She was Sophia Carter, CEO, strategist, visionary. She watched the news reports with quiet satisfaction, but she didn't let it distract her. There was still work to be done. She had spent years being overlooked, and now she had the opportunity to create something even greater than before. This wasn't just about reclaiming what she had lost. It was about building something that was truly, undeniably hers. Daniel ran into Sophia one last time. It wasn't in a courtroom, and it wasn't in a boardroom. It was purely by chance, a fleeting moment in which their paths crossed. He looked at her, searching for something, regret, hesitation, anything that suggested she missed the life they once shared. But all he saw was confidence. Strength. She had moved on. And for the first time, he realized he had lost far more than just a company. He had lost the woman he had never truly appreciated. Years later, Carter Enterprises thrived under Sophia's leadership. People no longer spoke of Daniel's fall, they spoke of Sophia's rise. She had proven, beyond a doubt, that she had never needed him. And as she stood in her office, overlooking the city, she smiled. This was her empire now. And it always had been.